AWS Elastic Beanstalk Service and Architecture. In this section, let's look at AWS Elastic Beanstalk Service, which is a PaaS application server service where we can deploy our applications. So what are the objectives? We're going to learn what AWS Elastic Beanstalk is, what are the features of AWS Elastic Beanstalk, what are the various usage patterns that are supported, the architecture, this is where we're going to be spending most of our time, building your application based upon Elastic Beanstalk. Then we look at how to launch an EB instance, deploying your application, and then connecting to your application. So what is AWS Elastic Beanstalk? Well, it's a PaaS service that makes it easy for deploying and scaling the web applications that you have built in the AWS cloud. Many times, Elastic Beanstalk is also referred to as EB, EB standing for Elastic Beanstalk. So the idea behind Elastic Beanstalk is that you simply build your applications and then you upload it to Elastic Beanstalk, which is really your deployment process. The Elastic Beanstalk environment automatically handles the deployment to all the various application servers instances that you may have. It also allows you to do capacity provisioning, so you can do auto scaling, and also it allows you to do load balancing because there can be a load balancer that could be associated with the various instances. It supports many different languages and platforms. We saw how there are different solutions that are out there, different platforms that are out there, and Elastic Beanstalk supports many of them. One of the cool things about Elastic Beanstalk is that it's actually built on top of AWS IaaS. So it's built on the EC2 platform, which is the Elastic Cloud Computing Platform. And so one of the cool things about Elastic Beanstalk is that you actually have the option to go under the hood and look at the actual instances. So what is the development stack, language, platform supported? Well, it so happens that AWS Beanstalk supports several platforms. It supports the Apache Tomcat for building Java web applications, Apache HTTP Server for PHP applications, Apache HTTP Server for Python applications, Nginx Apache HTTP Server for Node.js applications, Passenger Server for Ruby applications, and also Microsoft IIS for running .NET applications. And AWS claims that other platforms will be supported in the future as they are made available in the marketplace. So let's look at the features. The first feature is fast and simple deployment. It's very easy to deploy your applications in Elastic Beanstalk. You simply deploy using the AWS console, or you can deploy directly from your IDE or even from a source repository. You can actually upload multiple versions of the same application, and it maintains all the different versions, and you can actually run multiple versions at the same time across different environments. Monitoring is available through CloudWatch, which has metrics such as average CPU utilization, request count, latency, etc. There's also notifications. You can receive email notifications through SNS when the environment is changed. In terms of access log files, it's easy to access the log files. They're available through the console itself, but if you really want to, you are welcome to log into the instance itself and look at the access server log files. Don't forget, access server log files are the HTTP access server log files. You can restart the application server whenever you want to. The most important thing is that you have full control over your AWS resources. When you launch an Elastic Beanstalk instance, you're really launching a bunch of AWS resources like Elastic Load Balancer, S3, EBS, EC2 instance. And so you actually have the option of selecting which EC2 instance you want. You can even log into the EC2 instance for direct troubleshooting. You can also run other custom components inside the EC2 instances. Now you're actually doing your own customization. The point is that when they launch an EC2 instance for you, they already launched Tomcat or Nginx or Passenger Server in it. But if you want to run other things, you're welcome to log in and do those things if you want. They don't prevent you from doing that. Whereas other vendors do prevent you. Some vendors don't allow you to log into your actual instance where the application server is running. You can also adjust application server settings by logging in, changing JVM settings, and passing environment variables. You also have auto scaling. Because you have CloudWatch turned on, you can adjust the auto scaling settings so that you can set thresholds in order to determine when to add more instances or remove instances from the environment. In terms of security, the platform provider does everything they can. In this particular case, the AWS provider does everything they can in terms of making sure that the EC2 instances are secure, the platform application server has the right patches, has all the security patches done. But if you want, you can enhance security by enabling HTTPS, which is more along the lines of application security. And don't forget, as an app developer, you're responsible for your application security. In terms of availability, quickly improve application reliability by running in more than one availability zone. Don't forget that we have availability zone concept in AWS. So when you launch multiple instances, you may want to launch across multiple availability zones. So that gives you availability. In terms of other features, it integrates really well with other AWS services. It integrates on EC2 because when you're launching an Elastic Beanstalk application server instance, it's actually launching EC2 instances. So it really integrates well from that perspective. It also integrates with S3 because when you deploy your application, this is your application code files, whether it's your .war file or .zip file, whatever file it is, when you deploy your application, it actually gets copied into S3. So there is integration between Elastic Beanstalk and S3. You can also copy your application code in S3 and deploy it from there. Optionally, when your application is running, there are log files that are created. Those log files can also be stored in S3. Notice how AWS actually has synergy between these different products. So the AWS EB, as you can see, integrates with EC2 and S3. It also integrates with Amazon RDS. When you launch your Elastic Beanstalk environment, you can actually launch RDS, which is the relational database. We're not going to do that in this module. We're going to do that in the next module. But the point I'm trying to make is you can launch database instances if you want, right from Elastic Beanstalk. It also integrates with Elastic Load Balancing, which is your ELB, which is used for scaling. It integrates with auto scaling, where you can launch instances or shut down instances based upon certain criteria. It integrates with SNS, CloudWatch, so that it can send messages whenever certain criteria kick in. Also, it only runs on certain Amazon Linux AMI and Windows Server instances. I should say this is more of a restriction rather than a feature. The point I'm trying to make is you really cannot truly select the actual operating system for your instance. You can select the instance size, but not the operating system, because they have pre-configured which operating system works best for the application server. For example, they use heavily the Amazon Linux ANI or the Windows Server, special versions of Windows Server. The point I'm trying to make again is that you cannot choose your own instance for your Elastic Beanstalk. It's one step higher. We're abstracted away from it. In terms of usage patterns, with Amazon Elastic Beans, you can build highly scalable synchronous web applications, highly scalable asynchronous web processing. You can use Elastic Beanstalk for building your development environment only, test environment only, or production environment, or all three. You can also dynamically launch environments. That's another cool thing. Using an API, you can launch environments very, very fast. Okay, so let's look at the Elastic Beanstalk architectural components. There are several components and terms in Elastic Beanstalk that we need to familiarize ourselves with. They are application, application version, environment, environment tier, environment type, environment configuration, platform, and deployment. So let's go through each one of these things in a little bit more detail so we understand these terms and concepts in terms of elastic beanstalk. The term application is specific to AWS EB. It's not the same way as we think of an application. So please don't confuse the term application in Elastic Beanstalk with what we typically consider an application. When we talk about an application, we talk about a code base, a version. That's not what this is. In Elastic Beanstalk, an application is really a holder of environments. It's a holder. It holds multiple environments inside it. So it's a higher level abstract entity. Term application version is more like an application, like a Java web application. So please remember that application, when we use the term application in Elastic Beanstalk, it's really not a regular application. It's actually something that holds multiple environments. When we start looking at hands-on exercise in the next section on how to launch an Elastic Beans instance, this will become very obvious to you. An application version is more what we tend to think of an application. So really, whenever we use the term application version, it's really a specific deployable web application version. For example, a java.war file or a php.zip file. That's what an application version is. So an application version is really the application with a version associated with it. And there can be different versions of the same application. The applications, which are really application versions, are stored in S3. Whenever you deploy an application, it's really important for you to understand this. Whenever you deploy an application, it gets stored in S3. You can also explicitly store an application in S3, and then when you deploy it, at that time you can refer to it. So the point I'm trying to make is that the application version, which is really the application, which is really the .war file or the .zip file, that is stored in S3. Environment. An environment is really a collection of EC2 instances, load balancer, the auto-scaling group, the roles, resources, configurations, logs, audits, monitors, everything specific for an application to run. So think of an environment as in a dev environment or a QA environment, or there may be even multiple dev environments, dev 1, dev 2, maybe P&S, maybe a QA, maybe a staging environment. So really an environment is really a container of all the various resources that you have for an application to run. There can be multiple environments in an application. So there's actually a relationship now. So in your Elastic Beanstalk, you have the concept of an application. An application can have multiple environments, a dev environment, a QA environment, and so on and so forth. Each environment runs only a single version of the application. So an application can have multiple environments. Each environment only runs one application version, or at least, or you can think of it as one software or one web application at one time. Environment tier. There are two environment tier types. They support what is called the web server environment tier and web worker environment tier. If you recall, I talked about synchronous versus asynchronous programming model. In Elastic Beanstalk, if you're going to be building synchronous web applications, then they support the web server environment tier, which is what we're going to be using. They also have web worker environment tier, which is a queue-based asynchronous processing engine. You can also launch a web worker environment tier if you want. A web server environment tier, which is very, very popular, is really your 3-tier client, browser, application server, and a persistence tier framework. The Elastic Beanstalk basically in the web server environment tier installs the application server such as Apache Tomcat or Apache Web Server in your EC2 instance, and then it handles HTTP requests from the client, which then process the business logic and send the response back to the user. So it's a request response paradigm. It's a typical web application. The web worker environment tier is a little bit more tricky. It's a little bit different. In this, the clients communicate to a queue. They send messages into a queue, and then the queue is picked up by these worker applications, and the worker applications is what you deploy in a web worker environment. If you recall, I talked about asynchronous processing. I said that certain languages, certain platforms do not provide you with multi-threading background processing concepts. So this kind of an environment is given to you by the Elastic Beanstalk application environment. You can actually combine your web server and web worker environment. For example, you may have clients that are coming in to your application. They're sending requests, you're processing it and giving responses back to the client. But then there are certain requests that they send that may be put into a queue, and then there is the background web worker process that actually processes it and does whatever needs to be done. So for example, somebody comes to your web application, fills an order, you process the order, you write the record to the database, and then once the order is fulfilled, a message is put into the SQS queue, which then gets processed, and an email is sent back to the client, to the customer, or even to the monitoring service. So that would be an example of web server and web worker working together. Environment type. Environment type depends upon the load profile of the application. What do I mean by this? Well, if you recall, when we talked about past application server architecture, I said an application server vendor may have the capability to launch simple application server instances or complex application server instances. There are two, these are defined by what we call environment types. What type of environment do you have? Well, do you have a single instance environment, or do you have a load balancing auto scaling environment? So environment type defines whether you have a single instance one server environment, or you have a load balancing environment where there's a load balancer and there are multiple servers behind the load balancer, S1, S2, and S3, and the load balancer is load balancing across both of them. Now you can, when you launch your environment, decide to go with a simple single instance or a complex load balanced environment. A single instance environment is really an environment which contains one EC2 instance with an elastic IP. It does not have a load balancer in the front. It's really one application server. Environment uses auto scaling service, but all the values for the auto scaling services are set to 1, because really there is minimum instance is 1 and the maximum instance is 1. For all intents and purposes, you can think of that there is no real auto scaling service here. Really, it's a single instance environment, and you use this only when you think that the application load is expected to be low for your environment. Primarily used for developing or testing your applications. It's a lower cost environment because all you really is paying for the EC2. There is no load balancer associated with this particular environment. The second environment type is the load balanced auto scaling environment type, which uses auto scaling service. Auto scaling can automatically start additional instances and accommodate new instances. There is actually a load balancer in this, so you'll be paying for the load balancer, so there's a higher cost associated with this instance. You want to use this when application requires scalability. You may want to use this when you want it to be available, because you can also deploy your applications across multiple availability zones. So the load balancing auto scaling environment is used more for performance testing environments, high availability testing environment, or of course in production environments. Environment configuration. Environment configuration is another term that we should be aware of. It's the collection of parameters and settings that you have for your environment. Updating the parameters and settings may immediately take into effect or may not. So when you change your parameter in your environment setting, you may have to look at the fact whether it's going to take into effect immediately or it can only take effect until the environment gets restarted, because certain changes require the environment to be restarted. To be precise, the application server to be restarted. Just because you change the JVM memory size doesn't mean that it's going to take effect immediately. It has to be propagated and it has to be changed and relaunched, and the application server may have to be restarted. The basic idea behind environment configuration is you can set your parameters for your environment, you can store it, you can save it, And then you can later on apply that for other environments too. So for example, you may want to have environment settings for dev environment, another set of environment settings for QA environments, another one for production environment. And if you want to launch the QA environment again, you can use the same settings. Once again, we will look at these settings when we get into some hands-on. Platform. We talked about this. Platform is really your language, container, server environment. There are several platform stacks that are supported by Elastic Beanstalk. And as I mentioned to you earlier, new platforms are added as time progresses. So what do you need to do to build your application? Basically, you build your application based on the chosen and the provider's application server platform. So hopefully you're going to choose the platform that the provider supports, application server version, language supported, and the software services that are available. So you use these things as your criteria, and based upon the criteria, you build your application, which can be deployed in the Elastic Beanstalk environment. So how do you launch an Elastic Beanstalk instance? You go to your admin console, you click on Elastic Beanstalk, and the first thing you need to do in Elastic Beanstalk is to create an application. If you recall, an application is really not the way we think of an application code, which is really application version. An application is really a container that holds several environments. So you create an application, very easy. Then you can create an environment inside an application. Now, when you create an environment, this is when you have to choose your environment tier, whether you're doing a web server or a web worker tier. You have to choose your platform, whether you're choosing the Java platform or the PHP platform or the Ruby platform. Your environment type, whether it is a single instance environment type or a load balanced environment type, and also your application that you want to deploy. So right when you are launching your environment, you can say, here's the application that I wanted to deploy. By the way, you can also deploy it later on, but you have the opportunity to deploy it right here. So once again, if you want to launch an EB instance, you create an application, and inside the application, you create an environment, and then you launch the application inside the environment. So how do you launch or deploy your application? Well, there are many ways to deploy. You can deploy through the admin console by selecting a WAR file and deploying it. You can deploy through the AWS CLI. You can deploy through AWS SDK. You can deploy through the IDE itself. That's something you can do. There is a plugin available for your Eclipse plugin or the NetBeans plugin so that you can deploy directly from your IDE. You might want to try it on, play around with that. And the deployed applications are packaged as a .war or a .zip file. Once you've deployed your application, all you have to do is access your application. In order to access the application, you have to use the given URL. Every environment has a given URL that is associated with that particular environment. If it's a single instance environment, there'll be a URL right there for the single instance. If it's a auto-scaled load balanced environment, then you would have the URL of the load balancer. You simply use that particular URL to access the application using a browser. In summary, AWS Elastic Beanstalk is a PaaS service to deploy and scale web applications in the cloud, a service offered by AWS. Its features are fast, simple deployment, monitoring is supported, notifications, easy access to logs, and most important thing is you have full control over your AWS resources because it's built on top of AWS EC2. In terms of usage patterns, you can build dev, test, production environments, and also dynamic environments. In terms of the architecture, they have a concept called an application. An application has environments in them. Don't confuse an application with application version, which is really our software. An environment hosts an application version. An application version is the application, which is the WAR file or the zip file, and it supports two different environment tiers, synchronous web tier or the asynchronous worker tier. This is something you'll have to choose when you build your environment. You can also choose between various environment types, simple or elaborate environment type. The simple environment type is the single instance environment type. The elaborate environment type is the load balanced auto-scaled environment type. There are also support for different platforms, all the way from Apache Tomcat, Apache Server with PHP, Apache Server with Python, Nginx with Node.js, Passenger for Ruby, and Microsoft IIS for .NET applications. When it comes to launching an instance, all you have to do is create an application, then create an environment within the application. And when you create the environment, you have to say what the appropriate platform type is and what the environment type is, what the environment configuration is, and then you deploy. And the idea of deploying your application is to deploy through the admin console, AWS client tool, AWS SDK, or even your IDE. Once you've deployed your application, then you connect to your application using the provided URL. In the next section, we are going to do a hands-on exercise on creating the application, launching the environment inside it, and then deploying our code inside our environment and then connecting to it. We'll do it all hands-on, so it'll make it much clearer to you. This is more of a theoretical section.